What's with this early 2000s Justin Bieber hair? I don't think I can roll down the window. I have to turn the AC on. It's way too hot. Oh my god, like I'm sweating. Let's talk about social housing. I think I started up doing this as a new project because I really believe in social housing as like a common good, similar to what they kind of believe in Finland. It's part of their rights in Finland that housing is a common good and everybody has a right to housing. Now that's not necessarily employed here, although there is a bill being pushed through the Dáil at the moment by the People Before Profits leader, I believe, Richard Boyd Barrett. I don't know if it's going to get approved, but you know, fingers crossed it might actually happen. It just seems very vague. It'll be an amendment to the Constitution anyway. I think it's like the 34th amendment or the 32nd amendment to the Constitution. So I think that means that would go forward through as a referendum if it was to be approved by the Dáil, but it's early days, so we'll wait and see. I guess because I was fed up waiting for TDs to get back to me, I started contacting TDs over my housing situation a couple of weeks ago, and nobody's really biting, to be honest. Nobody has gotten back to me except one representative, not necessarily a TD, from the Social Democratic Party. I really don't give a shit about any particular political parties. I don't agree with an awful lot of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil's policies. However, I do like the current Housing Minister, Darragh O'Brien. I like his enthusiasm, I like that he's going full steam ahead, but I am very pro social housing, so I kind of want that to go forward. But I started this channel up because I realised, just by trawling the internet and by speaking to an awful lot of people that I know, that an awful lot of people are very uninformed about the housing process. And I was very uninformed about the housing process, so I decided to go and research it myself, and I found it really interesting. Just so you know, an awful lot of this is my own research and it could be incorrect. So if you have any facts or figures that differ from mine, please let me know. In saying that, maybe a good place to start would be the history of social housing in Ireland, or rather Dublin, because that seems to be where it started. I'm mostly going to focus on Dublin because that's where I live. That's where I'm from. This is my city, it's my community, and the issue that I have is with Dublin. However, if this, gains traction and people want me to talk about other counties, I absolutely can. That's no problem. But it will take more research and maybe a bit of travel as well, which I don't mind. But let's talk about the history of social housing. So social housing actually became more of a thing in the 1930s. So technically it's actually nearly 100 years old. Despite what an awful lot of people will lead you to believe, Ireland has had a social housing model for quite a long time. It was set up in the 1930s by the local county council, and their head architect was a gentleman called Herbert Sims. He was not just a social housing architect, but he did design a lot of communities such as Cabra and Crumlin, and I think he's most known for kind of like Chancery Place. Regardless, he was well renowned as a very good architect because he focused a lot on quality build and integrating communities. So his vision was more about not just building the actual build, but that it was of good quality, of good stock, fit for purpose, and that there were things around it like roads, schools, places to go, parks, shops, that kind of thing. Kind of in the 1940s he was promoted more or less because the city planner at the time had unfortunately died, so he was given I guess like his second job as city architect and as housing architect, but he took his own life in the 1950s because the pressure of the jobs was really overworking him. They kept his designs and ideas in mind, but they weren't executed very well because in the kind of 1950s, 1960s, 3 tenement buildings collapsed and it killed an awful lot of people. So the government set up the National Building Agency, or NBA, in 1963. And the NBA they wanted to build more tenements and kind of fix what had been broken. But they were also responsible for an awful lot of problematic building, such as what happened in Ballymun. So the issue with Ballymun, from what I can tell, was that when the towers went up, they basically went up in the middle of nowhere. Or even my own mother lives in Ballyfermot, and she was saying that when those social houses went up in Ballyfermot, they were built on, dirt. There was barely any foundation. There was no roads. It was just dirt footpaths, and the people who lived there basically had to make it themselves. And eventually, the county council came in and fixed it, and that was fine. But apparently, that's what happened in Ballymun. And then there was not only was it built kind of around nothing, but there was also no facilities there. There was no way for people to get to the city centre without walking or cycling or driving, but very few of them actually had cars. The towers were ugly and infested with rats. There was barely any schools or activities around, and a lot of people were out of work because they were impoverished. So crime and disease was rampant. In 2018, to kind of combat this, and bear in mind that was only 2 years ago, they set up the LDA, which is the Land Development Agency, and it was basically set up to right the wrongs of the past. Now, since then, there has been an awful lot of work done on Ballymun in particular, and it is a stunning community now. It's really beautiful. Of course, it still has a bad name, so does Ballyfermot, but they're both equally absolutely gorgeous places to live. If you've seen the Civic Centre and the Access Centre up in Ballymun, it's beautiful. There's tons of new apartment complexes going up there. There's really great bus routes. You've got the DCU University, and then you also have theatres, and the buildings are beautiful. The community is absolutely lovely. I've never had a bad time in Ballymun. I really like it there, and I have friends there as well. So that kind of leads us up to now. The LDA was established in 2018, and then I think they kind of formed in 2019. So their whole ethos around building now apparently is that they want integrated communities. So they want a mix of social housing and of private housing, and I think that's a really good idea. I think it's a great way of not continuing the mistakes that were made in the past, especially considering that so many people were killed by collapsing tenement buildings. Nobody wants that anymore. Whoop, sorry, gotta get around him. I think social housing as an approach is a really, really good idea, because it is an investment that the government makes into its own people. The journal.ie in particular, I'm not too sure where they got this article from, because they do tend to copy their articles from other news sites, but earlier on in the year, I believe it was this year, that the first man ever to be evicted from social housing was finally evicted after 4 years of not paying his bill. And when you go into social housing in Ireland, it is not a free house, despite what an awful lot of comments, particularly on the journal.ie, will have you believe. It's not free, you pay for it. You don't own it, but you pay the government your rent. The rent is just very cheap. You will pay 15% of whatever you earn, regardless of what that amount is. That includes if you're on social welfare. So this is a good way to subsidise housing, particularly for those who are impoverished or on very low income, and that they have a place to stay. Oh, sorry, my phone turned off because it overheated. So basically, the issue that an awful lot of people have here with social housing is the idea that people won't be evicted if they don't pay their rent. That was the issue up until about 2017, but now people are actually being evicted if they do not pay their rents to the government. So in conclusion, social housing here is that if you move into a social house, it does not belong to you. You pay 15% of whatever you earn to the government, and that is your rent. So if you're on 25,000 a year, gross, that is not net, then you owe the government usually about €275 a month. That's, I think, on average. So it's actually an investment that the government creates, turning the government into a landlord. As far as I'm aware, there is over 24,000 social properties in Ireland. So that's 24,000 properties that are generating revenue for the government. I cannot find figures from the government that states how much they actually make in rent from social housing, and I'd love to see that figure, because I think it would paint social housing in a much better light as a massive investment. So let's look at places where social housing is done correctly, and the biggest one is usually Vienna. Vienna is touted as the best social housing in the world and the best scheme. It was set up, I believe, in, I have notes by the way. So they're actually reaching the centenary of when it was set up. It was actually set up by Marxist social democrats who wanted to take privatization away from models such as housing, healthcare and education. So I believe Vienna, 60% of its 1.9 million population are in social housing. Their cut-off point, like their cap for how much you can earn to avail of social housing is about €45,000. So if you earn over that, you can't avail of social housing, but if you earn underneath that, you can. At the heart of what they do, they want to integrate people of different economic backgrounds. So I believe one of the main developers was quoted in saying that you wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at somebody how whether or not they were in social housing. So their idea was kind of a mixed population of different economic backgrounds, which I think is a lovely idea because that encourages more culture and less classism, I suppose. Another country that beat its homelessness was Finland. I think this one is a bit controversial personally. Finland ended its homelessness in between 2007 and I think it took them nearly 10 years, maybe a bit less. But it's not that, like, it's touted as if it was done overnight, and it wasn't really. It was a very meticulously developed plan, and it's the housing first plan. So basically what that means is that before you actually treat the homelessness, you treat the fact that there is no home. So homelessness can be down to a number of issues, whether that's financial, it could be down to mental issues, it could be down to whether or not someone is actually from this country, it could be drug abuse, it could be actual physical abuse, it could be fear. There's lots of reasons why people become homeless, but the biggest reason at that moment is that they are homeless. So in Finland, what they tried to do is put them into a home immediately and then provide services to help that individual with their problems. So it was not just housing them, it was helping them as well. There is an awful lot of facilities that people who in Finland are in a homelessness situation can avail of. What they did was they took a lot of the homelessness accommodation that they had and they actually refurbished them into accommodation. And how they did that was actually through co-living, from what I can see. Now, an awful lot of people, in Dublin in particular, are against co-living. I'm not completely against co-living, but I do agree with Owen O'Brien when he says that he's against gentrified co-living, which I am also against, because it's this idea of like a luxury lifestyle while also sharing, you know, a living space with people. And that's great when you're a student, but I don't believe in gentrifying that kind of lifestyle. On one hand, I do think it's a good idea for a more transient society, and Dublin is definitely transient, and I mean as if like there's a lot of people coming to work here and then leaving after a few months, and then, you know, like Irish people included. So that is a good idea for very, very short term lets. I don't think it's a good idea long term for living though. And it's definitely, if you would take Finland as an example, it's definitely a good idea to help combat homelessness, because from that you could build a small community. Finland is an awful lot smaller than the test group that they used is an awful lot smaller than the population that we have here though. So I don't know how it would work out. I do think what they did was lovely though, and it wasn't just co-living tenements. They, you know, all of these co-living units were beautifully built. I've taken a look at some of the pictures. They are very nice, very stylish, but also very comforting. They had a lot of facilities, including mental health ones, and then they also had things like gyms, saunas, because it's Finland, and shops. Now, I don't know if all of it is co-living. I wasn't really able to find out that information, if all homelessness kind of emergency accommodation there was co-living, but it is definitely an interesting kind of focus group to look at. So this is actually why I went on a drive today. I had to pick up these forms. So let's talk about the housing list, HAP, RAS, and getting yourself onto the housing list. There's a number of criteria that you have to meet before you are eligible to go on the housing list and to avail of HAP. Basically, you need to be over 18, you have to be legally resident in Ireland, You have to earn 35,000 a year or under. That is your limit. It is slightly more if you are a single parent, if you're a couple with a child, or if you're a couple. And the last criteria I think is actually intentionally vague, and it's just that you have to have an actual need for housing. I think this might be to kind of curtail the idea that someone can turn 18, live with their parents, and, you know, immediately go on the housing list, so they can kind of control the housing list that way. Now, I don't think there's actually anything wrong with people going on the housing list. There are a lot of genuine needs, and that includes turning 18 and wanting your own place. I think that should, you know, it should be of benefit to people who actively need it. Usually it's handled by the council on a case-by-case basis, so it totally depends on what your circumstances are. If you are of a certain age and you may have lost your accommodation, lost your job, you have a medical need, if you are a traveller, if you have a specific physical need, you know, these will all contribute to your eligibility for, you know, being either on HAP or on the housing list. So there is a big difference between HAP and between RAS. HAP is the housing assistance payment, and then RAS is the rent allowance payment. HAP is automatically awarded as soon as you are on the housing list, and when you move into a HAP accommodation, you're still on the housing list. RAS is the rent allowance scheme, and RAS is if you have been in accommodation for more than 2 years and then you need rent allowance, you can go on rent allowance. I'm not actually too sure what the criteria around RAS is in terms of how much they contribute to your rent, but I know for HAP in Dublin there are certain rent limits. If you are a single person, that rent limit is €660. So essentially the government pay €660 towards your rent. They don't pay you, they pay the landlords directly. However, we all know that in Dublin it's next to impossible to find any sort of rented accommodation that isn't sharing for €660, and Dublin County Council are aware of this. They can you can negotiate with them basically to up this by about 20%, and depending on your circumstances, but this is handled by a case-by-case basis, so it completely depends on the circumstances. Some people are happy with the 660, and it's just that little bit that they need to get them into rented accommodation and to get them, you know, potentially out of a bad situation, one of them being poverty. But some people do have to negotiate that up, and with skyrocketing rents in Dublin, this is, you know, probably more the case. As I said, you're still on the housing list if you are in receipt of a HAP payment, but please note that the housing list currently stands in Dublin at 29,000 households. 40% of all people on the housing list are single applicants. And bear in mind that there are over 6,000 adults who are homeless in Dublin, and they get top priority. The priority criteria, it's called the, I think it's grade A. So there's grade A, B and C. Someone who is grade A is basically someone who is actively in homelessness emergency accommodation, someone who has a medical need, someone who is a traveller, and I forget what the last one is. But anyway, these are all necessary. They need the housing immediately, and they will be put forward immediately. Now, that being said, there are lots of people who have been in emergency accommodation for well over 6 months, according to Focus Ireland statistics. I forget the actual number now, but it's not a low figure. So don't expect to be put into social housing accommodation when you go on the housing list, because some people wait as long as 12 years. You know, but take heed that, you know, you can rent a place when you're on HAP. It is illegal to discriminate against people who are on HAP, but usually the grounds that people are told no, essentially, is because HAP does not cover the rent. Another thing to note when you're on the housing list is that to actually get on the housing list for a particular county council, say for Dublin County Council, Leitrim, Tipperary, Tralee, that kind of thing, you need to either live in the area or have a local connection to that area. So what that usually means is a local connection could be anything from, I went to school in this area, and then you have to prove that by, you know, producing paperwork. Or you could say, I have an uncle in the area, and then you also have to prove that as well. and that would kind of get you into that area and on the social housing list for that particular area, if that's the route you want to go down. I can see an awful lot of people feel that they might not want to live in Dublin simply because it's too expensive, and I can completely understand that sentiment. It is very expensive, so that is another option if you thought you wanted to move out of the city. Let's talk housing news. So there's a lot of things that I want to cover in housing in particular, and it's like I want to do this from kind of week to week, so I can't really sum up the last week because there's lots of things that have come up in general since I started kind of really following this. I suppose one of the biggest that has come forward in the last while has been that People Before Profits, Richard Boyd Barrett, had pushed through that bill to enable everybody in Ireland to have a right to housing. Now, bear in mind that people in Ireland also have a right to work. That doesn't mean that the government has to physically provide that for you. It just means that you cannot be discriminated against by the government. So the wording around this can be kind of difficult. In fairness, it's a lot of legalese, and I really don't understand the repercussions of it. However, I think morally, fundamentally, everybody does and should have a right to housing, and I wholeheartedly agree with the bill. I don't have any faith that it will actually go through though, so, you know, take that with a pinch of salt. So also Sinn Féin's housing spokesperson Owen O'Brien wants to push through a bill that would completely ban any developments for co-living. This might seem a little bit controversial because I'm not completely against co-living. However, I don't really trust this country to do co-living in a way that is actually useful or intelligently made. As far as co-living for homelessness is concerned, I think that is a good idea because, again, it is a really nice way to integrate people back into a community and to develop a community around it. But I suppose a lot of people would be against that, and I've seen it work in Finland is the only reason that I would have that idea. But again, Finland's culture is completely different to ours. So I really don't know how that would work out here. It might be the wrong thing. It might be completely different. So there is some good news on the social housing front. These kind of happened around like August and July. So I actually like the current housing minister, Darragh O'Brien. Like I said, I really like his enthusiasm. I also like that he's acknowledged that 40% of people on the housing list are single people, they're single applicants, and that 60% of people who are in emergency accommodation are also single people. There's clearly a really big need for single apartments, for one-bedded apartments in Dublin, because that's not something that really exists here. Well, it does exist. We do have single-bedded apartments, but they're seen as not a good return on investment. However, if they were government built and were used as social housing, you know, there's clearly a need here, so I think that would be more beneficial to the population. He's done a number of things that I haven't agreed with, and I have agreed with, absolutely. So one of them was that there are a number of properties that are social housing, but they're actually far too damaged and they're not actually habitable, so they're out of the social housing circulation, and until they get fixed, apparently there's like a 19-week waiting list. So Darragh O'Brien dedicated 2 million in funding to fixing up these I guess like out of bounds social housing, to get them back into the social housing stock and rented out to people again. The Call for Housing Initiative. So the Call for Housing Initiative is to encourage people who have one-bedded apartments and they're finding them difficult to sell, because an awful lot of people, it's very difficult to get a mortgage on a one-bedded apartment, and it's because it's seen as not a good return on investment, and they're difficult to sell on. So I think this was a really good idea. I don't actually know how many apartments and houses have been sold to county councils through this Call for Housing Initiative, but I think it was a good idea and a good push forward, and I hope we get some sort of figure by the end of the year, and if that has actually contributed to the social housing building stock. Another thing as well is that he was on, I believe, News Talk on the 29th of July at about like 8 a.m, because I remember listening to it. And he was saying that he wanted the target to deliver social housing at the end of the year was about 11,000, and despite COVID they might actually reach or be close to that target despite the lockdown and everything that's happened. So that's great, that's really ambitious. And then in terms of like actual housing that isn't social, so like private housing, I'm not too sure what the figure is, but apparently we need about 40 to 50,000 a year. So that's looking good. In terms of the things he did that I really didn't fucking agree with was amending the emergency housing bill, which basically banned evictions and rent hikes, and now it's after causing 9 people to lose their home in Phibsborough, so that's a fucking thing that happened. There's also a grant that has been made to local county councils in the amount of 6 million per development. I think, I might be incorrect about this. So basically what this means is, as long as the county council want to go ahead and build social housing, they can do so up to a size limit and up to about a 6 million cost. And it's basically to encourage local county councils to start building their own social housing and renting them out. This was kind of not slammed by Sinn Féin's Owen O'Brien, who's the housing spokesperson. He's very, very vocal about housing in Dublin in particularly and in Ireland. But he was saying that something like even the bare minimum now is celebrated, and it's just not enough, because these developments will only kind of produce about 25 units per planning. And clearly we need an awful lot more. Now, on one hand, I agree with that, because, you know, it definitely should be more ambitious. But on the other, I'm like, come on, man, you know, celebrate. Now let me hit you with some scary statistics. So, obviously, homelessness is a massive issue in Dublin. I don't need to tell anybody that. It's clearly the case. Over 6,000 adults are currently homeless and in emergency homeless accommodation. So that actually only counts for the people in emergency accommodation. That doesn't account for the amount of people sleeping rough or hidden homelessness. Hidden homelessness is basically if someone is out of accommodation but they're doing things like couch surfing, and they're not declaring themselves as homeless. So they could have moved in with a family member and they're sleeping on the couch, or they're bunking with friends. Sorry, I keep saying adults. There's over 6,000 homeless people in Dublin. So 2,500 of those are children. Over 2,000 of those are women, and 3,500 are men. Those aren't exact figures, it's kind of in and around. As I said, 60% of homeless people who are on the streets are single people, and 40% of people who are on the housing list in desperate need of housing are also single. So clearly we need more one fully bed apartments here. And I guess now I could do my final thoughts. Or at least I would have final thoughts if my phone didn't completely fucking shit itself at that point and I didn't even notice until I got home to edit this. So to sum up a long story very fucking short, I think social housing is awesome. I don't trust this government to do co-living properly, even though I kind of agree with the co-living model. And I think Owen O'Brien and Darragh O'Brien are both brilliant in their own right and should work together, because at this point we actually don't have enough social housing to meet the massive demand, the massive social housing waiting list, and I'd really appreciate it if they could just both bury the fucking hatchet at this point and learn to compromise. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks, bye.